Okay, so the first couple of things about that you'll notice is this is not assignment 10. So we actually split the building codes assignment up so that we could give you this initial assignment, which is really much more broad than the later assignment, which turns out to be A11. So this is assignment 5, is your preliminary assessment of the building codes. And I know that's kind of a lot to swallow. If you have looked at the building codes before, you'll be familiar with these steps. If you have not, it looks totally intimidating. And we're going to kind of walk a little bit more slowly through a couple of those charts, because I want to help you guys sort of feel confident about going in and assessing what you need to kind of pay attention to for a high-rise building. Let me close this. I'm going to share a PowerPoint now about, just kind of breaking that down into a couple of nuggets so that you know what to do today and before Wednesday. Let me share the screen. Okay, do you see number 2? Oops, it was number 2. You see number 2?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is our building codes principles. So I wanted to show you that kind of video. It is available to you. The links for everything that you're going to need for this first part of the building codes are on the Canvas page. So on that page that's called assignments, review, requirements, etc. When you go to A5, you're going to find everything that you might want to reference. So the first thing is the International Building Code itself. It's online very conveniently now. So there's a link to the building codes where you can go through and find each of these chapters that we're referencing. There is the video that we just watched. There is another video on fire stairs that we're going to watch in a couple of minutes. There's the Appendix B, which is this standard form that we use in North Carolina. And then there's the building codes review chart that you just saw. That's that kind of purple form. And we're going to look at several chunks of that. It's a little bit more than just the first step. We're going to kind of go into the second step as well for this first part. So again, what's a little bit different, I made that video for the group last year when that was assignment 10. It's assignment 5 now. We were doing residential. We're not doing residential now. The building was smaller and mass timber was a prospect. Depending on what you're doing, you may be working with your faculty member on a mass timber scheme, but that is going to be a smaller building. So I don't know if anybody is using mass timber, but I'm not necessarily suggesting that you should. And depending on the size of your building, this is going to be something that's very new within the building codes. So you may not be thinking about mass timber at all, but let's sort of take the steps. So again, International Building Code we're going to use. You've got the link that's on Canvas, and we're going to flow through using the project code logic. This is what that kind of table of contents looks like. So if you're trying to find something about use and occupancy, you simply click on the chapter and it's going to take you in. And it's surprisingly manageable, honestly. So again, the first step, we're going to find our use and occupancy. And what we're going to do as part of A5 is create a summary that just has these basic descriptions of how the building codes influences the project, with a couple of diagrams and the Appendix B. Later in the semester, when your design is more firmed up, all of this we can do right now, even if we know the design is changing. Later in the semester, when you've got your plans, when you've got your sections, we're going to be doing some more detailed diagramming that really show kind of those calculations that would be necessary to make sure that we meet the building codes. But for right now, it's very broad brush. We want to make sure we don't sort of assume the wrong kinds of materials and that the building height we're assuming is possible. Okay, so when we look at the building codes, all of these criteria are interrelated. If we make a decision about one part, one interpretation of the building codes, it is going to influence what we do with the rest. So these are the things in this first part of the building code that we're going to pay attention to. The first is, what are people doing in this, in this building? And we know it's a mixed use building, so there's going to be 2 types. Whether we're treating it as a single use or a mixed use, remember that was in the video, and we can either pick the most restrictive value, or we can do some ratios and use 2 different values for assessing the construction type. are we separating or not separating those uses from each other? If we're using mixed use and we're sort of treating them as separated, we can actually optimize the construction. What building height and area can we use? Is this going to be sprinklered? What construction type are we going to anticipate? What are the fire ratings within that construction type? And what is the provisional occupancy that we expect for a floor? And as a result of that, how many fire stairs do we have? So this is the goal for this assignment. So occupancy. Who's using it? I actually don't want to use this slide. So who is using it? These are going to be the types of occupancy types that you're going to see. And what do you think we are going to have? And just go ahead and you can unmute for a minute. What types are we going to have in this high-rise building?
Genre during office hotel.
Okay, office hotel. So where would that fall?
Business.
Yep. Okay, so we'll probably have business. Everybody will have business. What else?
Assembly.
Okay, possibly assembly. Where would we have assembly?
I mean, if there's any kind of like theater spaces or like conference rooms over a certain size.
All of those. Maybe even restaurants. Yeah. Okay, so we've got we are very likely to have one of the types of assembly, and assembly has 5 different types. When you go in and you click on assembly, you're going to see, bowling alleys over here and restaurants over here, right? You're going to start to see some of the functions, and they do have different requirements. Anything else that you would expect to see in your project?
Maybe institutional.
Possibly. I don't think you're going to have institutional. So when we talk about institutions, I would probably put those under business. This kind of institutional refers to institutions where people are cared for. So even though we're talking about, we call, those types of special, maybe
or incarcerated.
Or incarcerated. So jails and mental institutions are what they mean by institutional. And the reason that they call them out is that people really don't have people couldn't get safely out of in a fire setting. They couldn't sort of easily run to a fire stair. In a jail, they can't easily run to a fire stair. So you can imagine, or if they are infirmed in some way, they can't easily get out safely. So super high requirements for institutional functions. So
although a nursing home is I'm sorry, one of my groups is doing some sort of senior living. So
okay.
That would be I4.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, so you may have institutional then. What else might you have from this list?
Exhibitional and museum space.
Yes, and what would that be in?
Educational.
So educational is really referring to schools. So even though it has an educational purpose, they're really referring to schools here. So it would probably be a business, and even universities are considered businesses, right? So even there, we don't call it educational. So again, back to business. But maybe
some museums might be assembly depending on the usage.
Okay. And what about
Right.
mercantile? Right, retail space. So we could have any one of those. I'm not seeing kind of others that jump out at me, but what that means is that each one of these is going to have different sets of requirements, and probably different parts of the building could meet different requirements. And if we were really building this and we were really paying the bills for all this construction, we may want to create a sort of separation where we can deal with one kind of construction in one area, and we, maybe sort of slightly less resistive if the risks are less, and more resistive in other parts. But let's go forward. I want to sort of show you that idea. First though, okay, so that's in chapter 3 where we're going to look at our main kinds of occupancies, but we may also have special conditions. In chapter 4, they start to go into special types of spaces that will also have different kinds of building code requirements. So covered malls and open malls, quite possibly. High rise, absolutely, because by definition we are. Atriums, 3 stories or greater spaces, quite possibly. Underground buildings, and they're not really referring to underground parking. But if you had other kinds of spaces that were for public gathering or use other than parking garages, you might have underground building components if they are more than 30 feet below grade, quite possibly. So what are they trying to get at with these conditions? They're saying with these, there are sort of special possibilities, special kind of risks or things that need to be considered. So for example, with malls, do we need to have special kinds of separation between tenants? Do we need to think about kiosks as sort of objects or kind of spatial conditions that live within another kind of spatial condition? So those are the kinds of things that the building codes will have like little tweaks relative to the malls. With high rises, we have changes in fire ratings and materials. We're going to be mandated to be sprinklered. They're going to talk about different levels of fire protection that are needed, as well as stairs and elevators that are sort of more specific when we get into taller buildings. With atriums, we're going to talk about fire separation from other spaces. We're going to talk about smoke evacuation systems. And again, you just want to look for your project. We know it's high rise, so you want to read that section. You may have a kind of mall type condition, so you want to read that section. You may have atria, so you want to read that section. You want to go into chapter 4 and begin to see what extra requirements you may have. So I wanted to talk about separation, the sort of second choice. If you have a mixed use building, you might start to think about using different standards of construction for the different portions. And what that requires you to do is to create really sort of robust fire separations between those parts of the building so that each area is really sort of separated from the other. So, you know, an example might be to sort of deal with the base of the building differently than you deal with the shaft of the tower, or to think about this sort of smaller podium piece as different construction from this larger tower piece. So you can think about these sort of broad breakdowns of the building as maybe opportunities where you might change construction. And that red line there is really suggesting that there would be a high degree of fire separation between these zones within the building. And that's what we mean by treating this as separated or not separated. If it's separated, you can meet different standards. If it's not separated, you have to pick the most resistive standard and meet it for the whole thing. Okay, so that's occupancy. And again, this is the first part of, you know, A5 is a summary, and we want you to sort of say what occupancy you're anticipating. So they're not the specific things like I have a museum, I have a senior living. It's assembly, business, mercantile, okay? So the next thing that we want to do is figure out, relative to the size of the building, what kinds of mandates we have on construction. And the idea is that the bigger the building is, the more fire resistant it needs to be. The taller the building is, the more fire resistant it needs to be. So we want to, again, look at our scheme and see what is going to be mandated in terms of the safety of the construction. And we're going to look at it. It can be dominated by the floor plate, you know, how big the sort of floor area is. It can actually, these are their sort of categories. We want to make sure that we check our height and see what the requirements are, what the floor area is, whether we anticipate expansion. You don't need to really pay attention to that. And is the building sprinklered? Assumption 1, the building is absolutely sprinklered. Assumption 2, floors and feet. We want to check both of those things. How many stories and how many feet? And knowing that at 420, we're going to have an extra stair. And when we talk about the floor plate, I want to be a little bit more nuanced. Normally, we would sort of say, what's the building, the area on a single floor? But if you start to have multiple floors that are linked together, multi-story spaces, we really want to talk about a fire area, which is basically all of the square footage that is interconnected where a fire could spread, right? So if I had a fire on one floor and I have an atrium and it can spread to other floors, I really want to talk about the fire area rather than just the simple floor plate. Okay, so once I you know am pretty sure on my occupancy, I can come into these charts, and this is just a partial chart. You can see I only have the assembly functions and the business function here. The chart goes on, right, for all those other types. And I'm going to start to want to look at how many floors I can build for each of these construction types, or more accurately, how many floors do I have, and can I build with any of these construction types? So let's just, for example's sake, say that we've got a 20-story building. If I look over on light wood, that is, I don't know. Oh, I know. Okay. Aside from A5, there is no 20-story building here that will ever be able to be built with sticks. The only reason this says it's unlimited is this is like bleachers and stadium seating. So it's not applicable. You don't want to look at A5 and say, oh yeah, I can do this out of sticks. Even if I look to heavy and mill, and this is an older table. So we need to get a new table that looks at mass timber and see, again, North Carolina building codes don't deal with mass timber yet. The international building codes, I think, just started this year. So we can look and maybe update some of this. But let's say we have a 30-story building. It's not going to go up to 30 stories. Even here with masonry, ordinary construction is basically a masonry shell and some kind of a spanning device. Typically, it would have been wood, but not even close to the high-rise numbers. Even here, there are no high-rises until I get over here to type 1 construction. So in some ways, if you're dealing with a smaller building, you may have all these other options for construction. Once we get to a high-rise, pretty much we're going to be in type 1 construction. So you can count on that. When we look at this a little bit further, if we think about what it's non-combustible, it can be made up of several different kinds of materials that are non-combustible: structural steel, concrete, masonry, brick, precast. All of those are going to be within this sort of type 1 type. And we need to look at whether or not we need to fire protect those elements. So if I look at type A is fire protected, type B is non-fire protected. And so even here, A5 is not your category, right? I can only go up to 11 stories without fire protection. So it's kind of decided for us when we're in a large building, it's going to be type 1, it's going to be fire protected. And once I'm in that very safe kind of construction, my height is unlimited and my area is unlimited, the number of stories and the amount of fire connected area, right? So that's kind of where we are. So in your summary, if you come up with another scenario, you're going to work that out with your faculty member, but the likelihood is that you're type 1A. And then from there, we go in and we say, well, like, okay, what's type 1A? So that's what we call our construction type. Type 1A is type 1 is going to get us over 5 stories. Over 11 stories, we're going to be type 1A. And we want to make sure, does that meet the requirements that of our design? And it's the most fire resistive. So of course the answer is going to be yes. But within this chart, you're going to test out the different construction types, and then you're going to say, this is my final type. That's the information that you're going to put into your summary and also into your appendix B. Okay, so that's your construction type. Fire resistance is kind of a part of that construction type. When we say I'm working with type 1A, it's sort of pointing me toward a set of materials: steel, concrete, possibly masonry, precast. What it's more, and it's also pointing me with the A toward protected construction. So that would be fireproofing on my steel, for example. But it also, underneath it, type 1, what it's really referring to is a set of fire resistance standards for the parts of my building, right? So if I am type 1A, again, the chart goes over to the right here, but we're kind of dealing with this first column. All of my primary structural frame members are going to have a fire resistance of 3 hours, okay? So this is the most stringent that we have, sort of resistance level that we have. And what it means is that for 3 hours in the heat of a fire, that element will be safe, right? So my structural frame needs 3 hours. My bearing walls, if they're exterior, need 3 hours. If I have interior bearing walls, 3 hours. So all of my structure needs 3 hours, okay? Non-bearing interior partitions and walls, 0. Don't have to worry about exactly what they're gonna be. But my floor construction, I don't want my floor collapsing very quickly at all. So I need 2 hours, my roof construction, 1.5 hours. And so when you determine what your construction type is, what it's really saying is, all of the elements need to meet a certain standard. And for us, this is on table 601. And it tells you for each of the parts of your construction. And this is getting a lot more detailed. What you really need to know right now is that it's going to be type 1, that it's going to be steel, concrete, probably, and masonry, unless you're in type 4 and have worked that out with your faculty member. But that's really more importantly what you're going to need to know now. We're not going to go in and do this right now, but I want to point you to what it would mean. Okay. And then this is sort of what it really means. If you say, I have a 3-hour construction, then you go in and you say, okay, how do I achieve 3 hours of safety with a certain system? And so all of these construction systems are basically tested by either the manufacturers and verified by the underwriter's laboratory. And this is just an example. On the right here is fire protected steel. And I typed in that I wanted fire protected steel with some kind of a spray foam insulation. And this diagram is basically accompanied by the amount of thickness of that insulation barrier to get me the rating, the fire rating. So 3 hours, I would need 1¼ inches over here. So this is way more detailed than what you're doing right now. I just wanted to sort of show you where it goes in the long run. Okay, so Appendix B. Appendix B is this form, this North Carolina form. It's actually really handy. And it's where you can kind of log in some of this information that you're discovering about how to meet the intention of the building codes. You're going to put your project name. You are the architect, put your names there. We are using the code for new construction, right? This is not core and shell, but let's use new construction because we've got all the mixed use down below. We're not in the North Carolina existing building code, so you can ignore that part. And the basic building data, what is your construction type? Do you need to be sprinklered? Do you need standpipes? And for the high rise, it's going to be yes. Is it sprinklered? Yes. And what is your construction type? 4, maybe, again, if you've worked it out with your faculty member, or 1A. Okay, so page 1, done. Page 2. Now we're going and trying to sort of calculate to make sure that the building area by floor, we actually probably don't need to absolutely do this step right now, because again, we'll fill in some of this a little bit later when we have a more precise design. So I'm going to go ahead and say for that piece, don't worry about it yet, but let's go in and look at our occupancy classifications. What kind of assembly do you have? Do you have business? How many of these do you actually have in your design? And are you going to treat these as separated or non-separated? So separated means I need to start to do some ratios, right? Some ratios between meeting one standard and another. Again, with this complexity, I would probably choose the non-separated use. You're not the contractor, the owner who needs to save lots of money. So, and for our purposes, I think understanding one set of standards is adequate. So I would probably choose non-separated and then not worry about this formula or this calculation. On page 3, I'm going to want you to say what is the allowable height in feet and stories for your construction type. And you saw that it was unlimited, but you should go back in and reconfirm that this in fact sort of applies to your project. And then what are those fire separation ratings that are required for each of these parts of the construction? And that's going to be on chart, it's on 9. Anyway, I'll give you the slide and you can find that table. And what is required, and then ultimately, what did you need? But again, what is required is really what we want for right now. Okay, so let me stop sharing there just for a second and see if there's, I know it's kind of like eating broccoli, but sorry about that. And if you love broccoli, then maybe it's, you know, like eating sardines or something. But let me see if there's questions. Okay, here we go. Oh my gosh. Oh, okay. No residential. Look for high-rise towers that are pretty much, you're looking for type 1 or type 2 due to height limitations. This is David Harrison. Due to height limitations and size limitations on the others.
Yeah, that should have been type 1A, type 1B. I just old codes still in my head sometimes.
Okay. Restaurants are inherently mixed use. Would hotel be assembly?
Hotel is residential. Anytime you have anybody sleeping, it's residential. It's just different types of residential. The caveat is any institution. So like we said, hospitals, jails, that's I2 or I3 or I1 or I4. So I'm jumping ahead to some of the answers we gave, Kelly.
Oh, okay. So you've been answering in there. I appreciate that. Anytime you're sleeping, da 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 da. Homeless shelter. Okay. Oops, I meant type 1 and A1B. Okay. Appendix B is the cheat sheet for us to explain our building to the county reviewers. It's great. Actually, Appendix B was created by an architect. So, and he's actually was my sort of building codes coach for like the first 10 years. He would come in and do this talk. And now I have to do this talk. But yeah, it's incredibly helpful. And it just sort of like puts us in to the formulas that they're going to look at. And what they used to do, they would do a preliminary review, just like what you guys are doing. And they would say, okay, before you go down any road, we want to make sure that you're going to be good later. So let's do the preliminary review. And then you're going to come back and show us how you met it. So yeah, so thank you.
I would say it's such a cheat sheet that it's required in North Carolina, but we adopted for South Carolina in our firm because it's just such an easy way to get them to understand the building. And it's the second sheet in our set of drawings past the cover sheet.
So you're really getting the thing that you're going to use in practice, and it's good to practice with it. So one last thing, and actually, sorry, I know it's sardines. It's not the funnest tech sim that you're ever going to have, but I do want you guys to see the fire stairs. So, you know, in that example that we gave, the 2 fire stairs were actually in the core. And that is sort of one of the strategies you can use. But fire stairs in themselves meet a lot of requirements. So I'm going to do one more video. Again, this one's 17 minutes. So, you know, put your seatbelt on and let's do that. And then I'll just say 2 more things about fire stairs and then we're done for the day. Okay, the last little nugget, it's about two more slides. So there was one thing that I did not think was very clear in that, and it was talking about the occupancy in the building as a whole, and you really want to think about the occupancy of the floor as sort of determinant of the number of fire stairs. So if you, I actually have this sort of covered in a slide, so I'm going to show you this. So when we're trying to calculate the occupancy, when we're trying to meet the intent of the building code, we are thinking about how many people theoretically could be in the building. And that theoretical number is how we determine the sizes of the different systems, as well as the numbers of things like fire stairs, doors, etc. And so with a high rise, if we think, say we've got 20 floors, and this is where that 30,000 square feet starts to be problematic. If we had that 30,000 square feet and we were thinking about a ratio where 12% of that was core, and so we had about 88% that was usable, when I'm actually determining my occupancy, I'm multiplying the amount of space on a floor and basically actually dividing it by the amount of space that's needed for each person. And that's giving me a theoretical occupancy. So if I said on a certain floor, I have 24,000 usable square feet, and the function, which is different than the overall occupancy, this is sort of the use of the space, was a business space, like an office space. Concentrated business use areas require 50 square foot per person. So if I knew that on a floor plate, I had a 24,000 square foot floor plate, and I divided it by 50 to get my theoretical number of occupants, I'm going to get 492. Now you'll recognize that that is precariously close to 500. So once I get bigger than that with this multiplier, that's when it kicks in and I need 3 fire stairs. So I may have 20 floors with almost 500 people on every floor, but it doesn't mean that I add all of those together and I suddenly have a building with 20 fire stairs. It's really assumed that the people who are leaving a floor are entering into the fire stair and beginning to move down, and everybody else is also entering at their levels. And it's assumed that they're not accumulating and creating, need for more fire stairs, but they're moving progressively down, and that everybody is exiting through the same fire stair. So you're not going to say, this is a theoretically 10,000 user building, and I therefore need, 20 fire stairs. Really, if we stay below that 30,000 number and under that 420-foot height, we have 2 fire stairs. Okay. So, and this kind of, we want to do a kind of rough calculation right now to know that you are kind of within those means. Again, that's why we want at this early stage to kind of check out how we're affected by the building codes so that we know, do you need 2 fire stairs? Do you need 3 fire stairs? So you can still do that rough calculation of your usable floor area on your tower. And as long as you are under, and then divide it by 50 square feet per person. If you are under 500, you need 2 fire stairs. So I hope that that's clear. It's a little tricky. We looked at that. Exit remoteness, we're not doing yet. Okay, so here is the assignment. So again, assignment 5 is the beginning of the preliminary codes analysis. You're going to want a summary. That is a 1-page explanation of how the building codes are influencing you in the broadest possible way. What is the use of your project? What are any kind of special occupancies like atriums, underground spaces, malls, or high-rise? Are you treating it as separated or assuming separated or non-separated construction? What's the height of your building and the area, the fire area? So that could typically be a floor plate or a kind of multi-story area with multiple floor plates. The construction type you're assuming and the fire ratings for that construction type. We addressed every one of these today in this sardine of a tech sim, but so you've heard something about all of these. In addition to that summary, 1 page, we want you to fill out the appropriate sections of Appendix B and also create a diagram. So you want a diagram of those lower level public spaces. Again, this is a rough sketch. We know the design may not be finalized. And one of the office portion, an office floor. So we want a diagrammatic section and a diagrammatic plan that illustrates the use and occupancy for those areas, right? So you may have business uses down below and business uses up above. You may have mercantile down below and business up above. You may have institutional down below and business up above. And that is the whole of this assignment: occupancy, height and area, and construction type. Okay, I'm gonna kill the slide and ask if there are any questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
If you have a 50-foot dead end corridor going past the fire stair, can you have a room on the other side, like past that corridor, or is 50 feet the maximum length of the building past the?
No. You can absolutely have a room. It's just the corridor itself, because presumably you wouldn't run into that room if you were trying to exit. So it's
Okay,
really,
cool.
it's really just trying to keep people from kind of getting themselves in places where they can't exit safely.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen some really ingenious solutions before where they had really long corridors that weren't attached to the stairs, and they basically made a loop, which sounds really dangerous to me, but technically, if you could sort of like use a different part of the loop to get to the fire stair, there are solutions to difficult questions of safety.
Kind of a
Okay,
racetrack.
question. What's that? A racetrack.
Kind of like a racetrack, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions? I know that's like the driest possible hour and a half we just had, but
I do have one exception for the accumulative,
please.
Kelly.
Yeah.
Because I know there's at least a number of projects, at least I've seen in the past, where people are doing some sort of assembly space at the top of their building, like a restaurant or a club or whatever. The stair is sized by that. So, or if you decide you have a restaurant in the middle of your building, that's gonna add a different amount of people than a business occupancy would. So once you have that stair go to the width required for that occupancy, that stair has to stay that width all the way down. So whatever your stair is, it has to remain that width all the way down. So doesn't really accumulate as much as just affects the width of the stair. So an example would be if I needed 48 inches for the stair from 30 to 12, but on the 11th floor, I had the exiting for a theater, and that required my stair to grow to 7 feet wide. I need to keep that 7 feet wide all the way down from 11 to grade. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you have those bigger uses up top that have a lot of people, that's what's going to determine your stair width, not your typical floor.
Right, so that 50, that square footage per occupant varies with uses. So you would need to go and
That's
look at
right.
restaurant uses, and that may be a lot, many more people assume to be in that space. So you need to take the worst case scenario and size the stair for that scenario.
That was a better way of saying it.
That's all right. That's good. No, it's great. It's a very good, good point. Other questions?